A millionaire helps a little girl shivering in the cold, selling flowers at a traffic light. When he brings the girl return her home, not long after, an ambulance blares through the neighborhood. Richard, a 65-year-old man with a distinguished record of accomplishments, had always thrived in his role as a leader. He often prided himself on never losing his composure. But that afternoon, during a critical meeting, something unexpected hit him hard. Just as he was about to conclude a business proposal, a sudden pain made him pause. His head pounded in a way he had never felt before. It was a pressure that seemed to spread behind his eyes. He tried to shake it off, maintaining his professional demeanor in front of the executives, but his hands started trembling and his vision blurred. "I'm not feeling well," he muttered, as if admitting it hurt more than the pain itself. With each passing second, the floor seemed to slip away, until Richard finally collapsed onto the conference room floor. Much to the shock of everyone around him, chaos erupted instantly, with colleagues exchanging worried glances as a few tried to assist him. Richard, disoriented, barely registered what was happening as he was rushed to the hospital, where a series of tests awaited him. He felt more exposed than ever when surrounded by equipment and medical professionals. Lying on the hospital bed with his mind still hazy, Richard struggled to suppress his growing anxiety, a foreign feeling for someone used to being in control of every detail. After what felt like an endless wait, the doctor entered the room. Weary, Richard looked up, searching for any indication of the results in the doctor's expression, but instead found a solemn face. The doctor adjusted his glasses, then, with a steady and serious tone, spoke words that would echo in Richard's mind for days to come. "Mr. Richard, I'm sorry to inform you that the tests indicate a large brain aneurysm. It's at a high risk of rupturing," the doctor said. Richard heard these words as if from a distance, each syllable striking like a blow. "What's the solution?" "I need you to do whatever it takes," he replied, striving to keep his usual decisive tone, though uncertainty had already crept into his voice. The doctor sighed, the kind of sigh that comes when delivering difficult news. "There's a surgery option, sir, but the chances of survival are only 2%. That means a 98% chance you won't make it. The other option is to wait." He paused. "You have, at most, 7 days. 7 days. Those words echoed in his mind like a hammer blow, turning everything around him into a dim haze. 7 days? You're telling me I'll be gone in a week? Only a week to set things right with my daughter?" he muttered, struggling to conceal his shock and disbelief. His empire, his life, everything he'd built now seemed like a fragile, meaningless illusion. What weighed on him most was the time he'd wasted building it all while his daughter grew up, far from his side. With a weary gesture, he dismissed the doctor and closed his eyes, trying to absorb the crushing weight of the diagnosis. On the way home, Richard sat silently in the back seat, watching the rain streak down the car windows, forming streams that blurred together in a shapeless swirl. Every raindrop sliding down the glass felt like a relentless reminder of time slipping away. 7 days. My whole life condensed to a week, he thought, a deep sadness finally surfacing, a grief he'd long refused to feel. After all, he had always chosen success, power, and the certainty that he controlled everything over family. Now, there was nowhere to run. Death awaited him, and he was about to face the one adversary he could never defeat. The car came to a halt at a red light, and Richard, lost in thought, noticed a scene that caught his eye. Outside, under the pouring rain, a small figure struggled to stay upright. It was a girl, no older than 8, holding a makeshift bouquet of flowers, her hands nearly blue from the cold. She approached each stopped car, offering the flowers with desperate hope, water streaming down her pale face. Richard watched, almost mesmerized, as she moved from car to car, pleading for attention, though no one seemed willing to help her. How could a little girl be out alone in a storm like this? Richard thought, feeling a tightness in his chest. The light turned green, but he hesitated. His driver looked in the rearview mirror, awaiting directions, but Richard couldn't tear his gaze from the girl. She approached his car with a hopeless expression, her lips trembling and her eyes brimming with tears, trying to make herself heard above the relentless pounding of the rain. Almost automatically, Richard lowered the window, and the girl ran over, clutching the flowers tightly as if it were her last chance. "Please, sir, buy my flowers," she said, her voice shaky and nearly lost in the sound of the rain. "My grandpa, he's home. He's sick. I need money for his medicine. Please, help me," she pleaded, tears spilling over her cheeks. The sincerity in her eyes was like a spark, piercing through the years of indifference Richard had built up. He felt a pang in his heart, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his own younger days, when he had once struggled to survive. Richard looked at the girl, taking in every detail of her small, frail frame, her wet hair, her pale face, and those eyes that held a pain he recognized. Where does this girl find such strength, he wondered, almost in admiration, but also disturbed by a feeling of helplessness. He had spent his life building an empire, yet here, faced with a child's desperate need, he felt achingly small. The girl held out her flowers, her hands cold, her fingers trembling. "Nobody wants to help me, sir. My grandpa needs the medicine. I just want to help him," she murmured, her voice cracking with a blend of hope and fear. Watching her, Richard found himself torn between the cold logic he had always lived by and a surge of compassion he'd long forgotten. The driver glanced back, uncertain, and asked quietly, "Sir, should we continue?" The question snapped Richard back to reality, and he nearly ordered them to drive on, but something inside him wouldn't let him abandon her in the rain. "Wait, just a little longer," he replied, his voice rough, not entirely understanding his own words. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a few bills, and handed them to the girl. She took them with trembling hands, looking up at him with a mix of gratitude and urgency. "Thank you. Thank you. I have to go. He really needs his medicine," she said, clutching the bills against her chest. Before Richard could react, the little girl turned and darted down the sidewalk, her small figure disappearing in the rain. Richard stood there, staring at the empty space she left behind, feeling an odd emptiness gnawing at him from within. 7 days. "What have I really done with my life?" Richard muttered, still sitting in the car, watching as the girl's figure grew smaller and smaller, fading into the rain. Something inside him wouldn't let him just leave her behind. Without hesitation, he leaned toward the driver and firmly instructed, "Follow that girl. I need to make sure she's all right." The command surprised the driver, but he turned the car around and sped up to catch up with her. Richard had his eyes fixed straight ahead, acting with an urgency he didn't fully comprehend. "What am I doing? This isn't my business, but I have to go." When they caught up, he lowered the car window and called out, his voice gentler now. "Hey kid, wait up." Janice stopped, her eyes wide with surprise as she approached cautiously. He took a moment to look at her pale face and wet hair. "What's your name?" he asked, feeling the need to connect somehow before saying anything more. She held onto the flowers in her hands as if they were her only anchor. "Janice, sir." "My name is Janice," she replied, hesitant, as though she wasn't used to talking to strangers. Richard nodded, her name echoing in his mind. "Janice, I'm here to help. Come on, show me where your grandfather is," he said, trying to reassure her. He stepped out of the car and offered his hand, which she hesitated before taking. "I don't know, sir. I don't know if you'll be able to make it. It's far and my grandpa's really sick, Janice mumbled, her voice shaky. Show me the way, Janice. We'll go together. She nodded, and the two of them climbed into the car. In the back seat, she looked small and fragile, but her eyes held a determined glint that surprised Richard. He managed a faint smile, something he hadn't done in a long time. Maybe this is something I can still do. Maybe this is my last chance to be of use, he thought, watching her point the way. Looking ahead, Janice spoke softly, almost a whisper. What's your name? Richard fell silent for a moment before answering. Richard. You can call me Richard, he said, his tone softer than he ever used with anyone. The girl nodded, whispering his name, as if testing its sound. Richard, thank you for helping me, she replied. She directed the driver down a road that grew increasingly secluded, moving further from the main streets into dimly lit, empty lanes. It's a bit further. Just keep straight and turn there, she explained, gesturing with her hands. Richard looked around, noticing how far they had strayed from everything. You live far out, Janice. Why are you alone out here in the rain? It's just my sick grandfather and me. No one else helps, so I have to manage this on my own. Finally, they arrived at a small house hidden among gloomy, bent trees that seemed to sag under the storm's weight. Janice got out without waiting, running toward the door. Richard followed, feeling strangely out of place yet determined not to turn back. Inside, Richard was met with a heartbreaking sight. Janice's grandfather lay on the floor, a frail-looking old man lying on his back, his face pale and lips unmoving. He wasn't breathing. Janice dropped to her knees beside him, taking his hand as if by some miracle she could bring him back. Grandpa, wake up, Grandpa. I brought help, she murmured desperately, and Richard realized time was against them. Richard knelt by the old man, feeling the urgency of the moment. He's not breathing, Janice. We're going to have to act quickly, all right? He placed his hands on the man's chest and began chest compressions, using all his strength. Every push was a monumental effort, and he wasn't sure if it was enough. Hang in there, sir. Don't leave us now. Your granddaughter needs you, he murmured as he focused on keeping a steady rhythm. Janice watched with wide, panicked eyes, her breathing unsteady as she stared, hoping for her grandfather to come back. You'll save him, right? He's going to breathe again, right? She begged, her voice a plea that tore at Richard's heart. He sighed, unsure how to answer. I'm trying, Janice. I'm doing everything I can. But we have to stay patient, all right? She nodded, though her eyes were filled with desperation. Richard alternated between chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth breaths, his face slick with sweat, despite the cold air. The strain in his arms grew, and exhaustion threatened to overcome him, but stopping wasn't an option. Janice held her grandfather's hand, her voice a trembling whisper. Grandpa, please, don't leave me alone. You promised you'd always take care of me. Her words pierced Richard's heart, pushing him to keep fighting, as if every second counted. Outside, the storm raged louder, the wind hammering against the house. Richard barely registered the sound of a nearby tree crashing down, blocking the path they'd traveled to get there. He knew the driver had called for an ambulance, but at this point, there weren't many options left. We just have to keep going. It's all we can do, Janice, he murmured through his exhaustion, his voice hoarse and strained. Janice looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes pleading. My grandpa Arthur is all I have. Please bring him back, she whispered, like a desperate prayer. Richard felt the weight of responsibility like never before, pushing aside the creeping despair. I'm trying, Janice. I promise. I won't give up. Not as long as there's a chance, he replied, though his own body was nearing collapse. The compressions continued, but Richard was growing weaker, his head pounding, his arms aching. He knew he had to keep going, yet his own body seemed on the verge of failure. Beside him, Janice knelt, clutching her grandfather's hand tightly. "Please don't leave, Grandpa. I still need you here," she sobbed, and somehow her pain had become his own. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Richard's head, an intense sensation that took over his body. He tried to push through it, but it felt like an electric current surged from his head to his toes. The room seemed to spin as his muscles seized. His vision blurred, and before he could react, he collapsed onto Arthur's chest, his consciousness slipping away like a final breath. Janice screamed in horror, watching as Richard's body went still, as though every last bit of his strength had finally left him. The house echoed with the sound of the storm and the heartbreaking cries of a young girl who, for the first time, felt truly alone. Janice stood, her heart pounding and breath shaky, staring at the two unmoving figures in front of her. Richard and her grandfather, Arthur, lay side by side. Both of them were motionless, both in desperate need of help. Struggling to hold back her fear, she picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed for emergency services, her voice breaking under the weight of the rain and her fear. "Please, I need an ambulance," she begged through her tears. "My grandfather and the man who tried to help him are in terrible shape. Please come quickly." The dispatcher on the other end tried to reassure her. "We're sending a unit to your location, dear," but the dispatcher warned that due to the heavy rain and blocked roads, it might take longer than usual. "Stay calm and try to check if both of them are breathing. The ambulance is on the way," she said, though her words only deepened Janice's panic. "How much longer? They need help now." Janice looked from her grandfather to Richard, unsure what else she could do, but the call ended before the dispatcher could answer her. The minutes dragged by, each second an agonizing wait. "They'll get here. They have to get here," she whispered, urging the two unconscious men to hold on, though she knew they couldn't hear her. Outside, the rain intensified, the sound of heavy drops hitting the roof, making the silence inside the house even more terrifying. Feeling small and powerless, Janice refused to give up. She knelt beside her grandfather, trying to recall the movements she had seen Richard perform. Placing her hands over his chest, she pressed firmly, desperate for him to breathe again. "Please, Grandpa, stay with me." "I can't lose you too," she pleaded, her tears mixing with the rain on her face. As she performed compressions, her gaze drifted to Richard, whose face was pale and still. This man, who she barely knew but who had risked everything to save her grandfather, lay there helpless, with no one to aid him. "I don't know how to help you, but you have to stay strong," she whispered, feeling helpless but determined. Her hands pressed steadily down, each compression on Arthur's chest making her arms ache, but she didn't let up, clinging to hope. Finally, she heard sirens approaching in the distance. A thread of hope sparked within Janice. "They're coming. They'll save you," she murmured, willing her words to be true as she looked at them, silently begging for a miracle. But the ambulance was still a ways off, and she knew time was running out. Desperately, she pushed harder on Arthur's chest, as though she could will him to breathe again. "Please, Grandpa, you promised you'd never leave me alone." As the lights of the ambulance finally cast shadows through the house's doorway, Janice ran outside, waving frantically to guide the paramedics in. "They're here, please help them," she shouted, her voice cracking as she ushered the team inside. The paramedics quickly began assessing both men, while Janice watched with wide eyes and a pounding heart. "You have to save them. They're all I have left." One paramedic began performing CPR on Arthur, while another checked Richard. The grave expressions on their faces told her how serious the situation was, and she bit her lip, fearing the worst. "We'll do what we can, but both are in critical condition," one of them said, his tone calm but heavy. Janice clenched her fists, knowing there was nothing more she could do but hope and pray. The rain still poured down heavily, complicating the paramedics' efforts to transport Richard and Arthur to the ambulance. They had to work around a fallen tree blocking the path, moving the two men with utmost care. Janice followed closely, her gaze locked on her grandfather and Richard, refusing to look away. They can't die. Not now, she thought, fighting back tears. Inside the ambulance, she clung to her grandfather's hand, as if it were the last thread holding her world together. The ride was tense, every moment thick with urgency. Suddenly, Arthur went into cardiac arrest, and the paramedics sprang into action with the defibrillator, working fervently to bring him back. "Please, sir, stay with us. The girl needs you," murmured one of the paramedics, as Janice stood by, wide-eyed and trembling with fear. "Don't give up, Grandpa. I'm right here," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. Richard lay on the stretcher, his face pale, eyes closed, completely still. The bluish monitor displayed his rapidly rising brain pressure, a sign that the aneurysm, a dangerous bulge in an artery, could burst at any moment. Janice wasn't sure what exactly the doctors were tracking, but she understood enough to know Richard was in grave danger. She watched him, hoping her presence could somehow bring him a sense of peace, even if he was unconscious. "Richard, please, you helped me. Now you need to fight. Don't give up now," she whispered, hoping her words would reach him. The ambulance sped through the city streets under a relentless downpour, and every mile felt like an eternity. Janice was torn between the fear of losing her grandfather and the gratitude she felt toward Richard, who had risked his life to help them. Suddenly, a loud beep sounded from her grandfather's monitor, and the paramedics urgently announced that he'd gone into cardiac arrest once more. Janice watched helplessly as the paramedics worked to revive him with chest compressions and a defibrillator. This can't be happening. This can't be real, she thought, her eyes stinging as she fought back tears. After what felt like an endless struggle, they arrived at the hospital. Janice's heart sank as she watched the paramedics rush her grandfather through the emergency doors. She stood there, staring down the long, cold hallway, watching the doctors disappear, a hollow feeling growing within her as if a part of her had been carried off with them. "Grandpa Richard, please stay with me," she whispered, her mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. Moments later, a doctor approached and informed her that both Richard and her grandfather were in critical condition. Richard needed emergency surgery to prevent his aneurysm from rupturing, but the only surgeon skilled enough, Dr. Murray, was in the middle of another operation. Janice's desperation grew at the news. "But Richard needs help now. He doesn't have time to wait," she protested, her voice quivering as the doctor gave her a sympathetic look. "Darling, we're doing all we can, but you have to stay strong now," he said, trying to bring a bit of calm to the girl who was struggling to hold back tears. Sitting in the waiting room, Janice's mind could barely focus on anything other than Richard and her grandfather. Richard was someone who had it all, a stranger who had stopped to help someone like her, asking for nothing in return. He'd risked everything, and now he was here, locked in a silent battle for his own life. "Why did you do that, Richard?" she wondered, grappling with what might have driven him to such a selfless act. "I can't lose both of you. I just can't," she whispered to herself, feeling the weight of the responsibility Richard had left on her shoulders. Later, a nurse came into the waiting room, looking serious as he explained that her grandfather's condition had worsened during transport. He had suffered several cardiac arrests, each one lowering his chances of recovery. "We're doing everything we can, but it's a very delicate situation," the nurse said, in a tone that seemed to brace Janice for the worst. She felt a chill run down her spine, but took a deep breath, clinging to hope. Shortly after, Janice was escorted into the room where both men lay. The sight of them made her shiver. Her grandfather was hooked up to multiple machines, each heartbeat seeming like a fragile whisper. On the other side, Richard looked even paler, and a doctor mentioned that the pressure inside his head was dangerously high, with an aneurysm that could burst at any moment. Janice looked at them, every detail underscoring how critical things were. They need help now. There can't be any more delay, she thought, as rising panic gripped her. When Dr. Murray, the neurosurgeon, entered the room, the tension grew even thicker in the air. He glanced at the monitors, then back at Janice, who watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Murray chose his words carefully. "Janice, the situation is critical for both of them. Your grandfather's ability to recover is slipping away by the minute, and Mr. Richard, the bleeding in his brain is worsening. I can only operate on one of them right now." But her grandfather's lack of medical coverage stopped his sentence cold. The silence that followed was nearly unbearable, and Janice felt a lump tightening in her throat, struggling to grasp the cruelty of such a choice. She dropped to her knees before the doctor, her face wet with tears. "Please, Dr. Murray, save them both, please. Help my grandfather," she pleaded, her voice choked with desperation. "He's all the family I have." The doctor looked at her with sorrowful eyes and leaned down, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I understand, Janice, but the surgery is complicated and comes with a high cost. The hospital needs to ensure payment before proceeding." Dr. Murray's words sliced through her like a knife. She had no way to cover such an expensive surgery and knew the hospital wouldn't operate without payment. "It's not much, but it's all I have," she whispered, barely able to speak as she handed him a small stack of bills from things she had tried to sell earlier. The doctor shook his head. It was far from the amount needed. Reality was harsh and unyielding, leaving her with a feeling of helplessness she had never known before. "I need help. Someone please, there has to be another way." As Janice grappled with the gravity of the situation, Richard's eyes slowly fluttered open, blinking in confusion as his vision cleared, and he spotted Janice. She was kneeling, crying, while the doctor tried to explain the circumstances. Seeing her in distress filled him with a sense of urgency. "Janice, what's happening?" he asked, his voice weak but full of concern. She quickly stood up, grasping Richard's hand with a look heavy with emotion. "Richard, they're saying my grandfather needs surgery, but it's so expensive. And I don't have the money to pay for it," she whispered, her words barely audible. Richard felt the weight of her words sink in. Without hesitation, he gripped her hand and looked at the doctor. "Dr. Murray, I'll cover whatever's needed. The surgery has to be done for her grandfather, no matter what," he declared, attempting to keep his voice steady, despite the pounding pain in his head. The doctor nodded in surprise and handed over the clipboard with the authorization documents. "This is an expensive and risky procedure, Mr. Richard. We need your signature to confirm the payment." Richard nodded, pushing aside his own pain to stay focused. With trembling hands, he picked up the pen, determined to do whatever it took to help Janice's grandfather. "Don't worry, Janice. Your grandfather will get the help he needs." He forced a smile, trying to reassure her. Janice watched him with overwhelming gratitude mixed with evident concern. "Richard, are you sure? You don't have to do this. What if this hurts you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard looked at her with a mix of pain and compassion. "I've already made up my mind, Janice. Your grandfather needs help now, and I'm here to make sure he gets it," he replied, feeling the weight of each word as he held the pen, preparing to sign. But as he started to write, a sharp pain shot through his head, as if his body was warning him of the risk he was taking. He took a deep breath, trying to hold on, but his vision started to blur, and his fingers weakened, almost dropping the pen. I "I need to sign this," he murmured, determined to finish, even as his body threatened to give out. Just as he placed the pen on the paper, an unbearable pain exploded in his head, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. He collapsed backward, his face contorted in pain as the pen slipped from his fingers. Janice screamed and tried to catch him, her eyes wide with terror. "Richard, no, please stay with me. You have to hold on." Richard's body convulsed violently, each spasm seeming to push him further away. The doctors around them sprang into action, while Janice, pale and wide-eyed, stood by helplessly. "Richard, no. You can't leave me. Not now," she whispered, fear turning her voice into a desperate plea. The medical team gently moved her aside as they worked urgently to stabilize him. She stepped back, too drained to protest, watching as the medical staff raced to save him. Richard's condition began to worsen, a clear sign that the aneurysm had finally ruptured. The doctors exchanged solemn glances, urgency written across each face. "We're losing him," murmured one doctor, holding his breath while examining Richard's pupils. They were dilated, signaling the grim possibility of imminent brain death. Standing by the wall in the room, Janice felt her heart sink as she watched the doctors deliberate on the situation. Every second seemed to deepen the crisis, and one doctor, with a somber look, whispered to a colleague nearby, "If his blood pressure keeps climbing, he won't make it. We might have to consider declaring brain death." The words were spoken softly, almost as if to keep Janice from hearing. Yet she did hear, and it felt like the ground was slipping out from under her feet. Brain death? No, this can't be happening. Her heart raced in desperation as the doctors debated. One of them proposed one last attempt at intervention, but others disagreed, arguing that Richard's condition was too severe for any procedure. "He's almost completely without brain activity," stated one doctor, glancing at the monitors that displayed an almost flat line. Janice watched with tears streaming down her face. He risked everything. "And now, I'm going to lose them both," she murmured, feeling her heart break with each passing moment. Still, the team decided to try one last effort, awaiting a final decision on Richard's status. In the other operating room, Arthur's condition was also declining. During his procedure, his heart stopped, and the team rushed to use the defibrillator, trying to revive him. Alone in the waiting room, Janice had no idea what was happening with her grandfather, but a deep sense of dread grew within her by the second. Leaning against the cold wall, Janice clasped her hands together and began to pray silently, pleading for a miracle. "God, please, don't take my grandfather and Richard. They're all I have. I need them with me, please." Tears continued to stream down her cheeks as she closed her eyes, trying to focus on her prayer, as though it were the only thing holding her steady in that moment. Richard's brain pressure continued to rise, and one of the doctors finally exhaled, looking at the monitors. "We're running out of time. We can't wait any longer," he said, his voice carrying a resignation that underscored the gravity of the situation. They started setting up the equipment while the monitor line flickered. The only sounds that broke the silence were the monitor's erratic beeps and the steady hum of hospital noises. "Richard, please fight. Don't leave us," one of the nurses whispered, clinging to hope. In the operating room next door, the team continued their efforts to revive Arthur, but the heart monitor displayed a flat line. "Get the defibrillator ready. We're going to try one more time," the surgeon shouted as the team swiftly moved around the table. The machine's charging sound filled the room, and in the waiting area, Janice was praying intensely, unaware of what was happening, but feeling an overwhelming sense of dread growing inside her. With eyes closed, she gripped her hands tighter, her prayer intensifying. "Please, God, give them one more chance. I have no one else but them. "Don't take this from me now," she whispered, trying to hold back tears, refusing to accept the possibility of losing the two people who meant everything to her. In that hospital, by herself, feeling small and helpless, she experienced uncertainty. Back in Richard's room, doctors were working to stabilize him, but the situation was spinning out of control. The bleeding had spread quickly, and the monitor indicated he was slipping into a deep coma. One doctor made a final attempt to reverse the situation, but the monitor line began to drop, signaling his brain activity was close to nothing. "He's not going to make it, we're losing him," the lead doctor murmured, his face full of sorrow. Just as Richard entered a deep coma, a shout echoed from the operating room next door. "Defibrillator, quickly! We need to revive him." Richard's diagnosis of brain death hit like a merciless blow. Standing alone in the hallway, Janice struggled to absorb the reality the doctors had just confirmed. They had told her there was nothing more to be done, that Richard's body remained, but the life she knew within him had faded. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process the thought that the man who had risked everything for her grandfather was now in a state from which he might never return. "No, this can't be happening. He can't leave me now," Janice muttered, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold back the overwhelming fear. Sitting on a cold, empty bench in the waiting area, she clung to herself, fighting against the rising panic. She wanted to scream, to beg, to do anything that might change the doctors' minds, to make them hear her. But all she could manage was to sit there alone, eyes fixed on the doors where Richard was. "Richard, please, you can't leave me. You promised you'd stay," she whispered, her voice trembling, as if her words might somehow reach him. The doctor confirmed Richard's difficult signature on the papers he'd signed to authorize surgery for her grandfather, Arthur. With the approval in hand, the team hurried to take Arthur into the operating room, leaving Richard in intensive care as his condition grew more severe. Janice watched every movement of the medical staff, her heart torn between gratitude and terror. "He did this for me. He really did," she thought, unable to stop the stream of tears running down her cheeks. As she waited anxiously for news of her grandfather's surgery, Janice paced the hallway, each short step slow and unsteady. Her heart pounded faster with every sound, each time hoping it might be a doctor with news. Time crawled by, and her fear of losing both of them grew with every second. "Please, Grandpa, you have to come back. And Richard, you have to fight too," she whispered, squeezing her hands together in a desperate prayer. Hours later, a doctor finally emerged from the operating room, walking towards her with a weary, serious expression. Janice looked up at him immediately, tears streaming down her face as she braced herself for the news she dreaded. "Miss Janice," the doctor began, "your grandfather survived the surgery. We did everything we could, but his condition is still critical. He'll need a lot of care, and there may be lasting effects." The doctor's words hit her hard. Relief flooded her at knowing her grandfather was alive, offering a fleeting moment of peace, but the thought that he might never be the same filled her heart with sorrow. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you for not giving up on him," she whispered, wiping away her tears as she struggled to accept the reality before her. "Grandpa, you'll be back. I know you will. I'll be here waiting for you," she murmured to herself, clinging to a small glimmer of hope. Lost in her thoughts, Janice noticed a figure at the end of the hallway. A tall woman with blonde hair falling messily around her face was walking hurriedly, her face etched with worry and her eyes swollen from crying. Her expression was pure desperation, and Janice realized she was likely seeking urgent information. One of the nurses stopped beside the woman, touching her face gently and whispering something softly. Janice caught the name Richard, and her heart skipped a beat, That must be his daughter. It has to be her, she thought, feeling a faint hope rise within. The nurse motioned for Richard's daughter to follow him down a hallway leading to her father's room. Unable to contain herself, Janice ran toward the woman. Her heart raced at the thought that this might be the one person who could save Richard. As she got closer, she hesitated for a moment, but her determination to fight for Richard's life outweighed her fear. "Ma'am, please wait," Janice called out with a trembling voice. Carolyn stopped suddenly, looking down to face the girl, now standing before her. Struggling to find the right words, Janice clasped her hands, her face wet with tears, and said, "I'm Janice, your father. He helped me. He risked everything for me and my grandpa." Her voice was barely audible, but filled with pain. Carolyn, puzzled, tried to make sense of the girl's words, uncertain of what her father had done. "What do you mean, child?" "My father risked everything for you," Carolyn murmured, still confused. Janice nodded, fighting back tears. "My name is Janice. I was selling flowers. My grandpa was very sick and no one stopped to help. But your father..." He stopped. "He offered to help. He even signed the authorization so my grandpa could get his surgery first," Janice explained, her voice breaking. "I'm Carolyn," the woman replied softly. "I just received news about my father's condition. I came here to disconnect the machines." That was his choice, his wish. "My father always said he didn't want to live like this," explained Carolyn. But the girl knelt before her, gripping her legs in desperation. "Please, Mom, don't turn off the machines. He can still come back. He deserves a chance," she begged, her eyes filled with hope and pleading. Carolyn took a deep breath, trying to make sense of this child's request, and lowered herself beside her. "But why did he do that for you? Why did my father risk everything like that?" she questioned, trying to grasp the connection that somehow bound Richard to this girl. Through tearful gasps, Janice replied, "He was the only one who stopped, the only one who helped me when no one else cared to listen. He risked his life to save my grandpa. He gave me hope." Carolyn stood in silence, absorbing Janice's words and feeling the weight of a decision too heavy to be made in that moment. Janice's eyes searched hers, desperately hoping she wouldn't make an irreversible choice. "Please, I know he's still there. He's strong. He needs this chance. Just give him a little more time," she pleaded, her voice a whisper full of pain and hope. Just then, an alert began beeping from the monitor beside Richard, breaking the silence with its sharp, relentless sound. Janice and Carolyn turned at once to look into Richard's room, the alarm echoing like a grim reminder. Janice's desperation intensified, and she looked at Carolyn, her eyes full of fear, as if her own life depended on the decision being made. "Please, he's trying to fight. I know he is. Don't let him go," she whispered, her face streaked with tears once more. Carolyn remained quiet, breathing heavily. One by one, the machines that kept Richard alive began to fail, and Janice felt as though each sound was ripping away a part of her hope. She gripped Carolyn's hand tighter, nearly praying for a miracle. The steady hum of the machines turned into an alarming tone, growing louder with each passing second. The monitors that had been showing a steady line now emitted sharp, broken sounds, with peaks spiking and disappearing as if the system itself was close to giving up. Janice, kneeling beside Carolyn, caught the strange noise coming from Richard's room. Her heart raced as she stood up, eyes locked on the machines that were now signaling an emergency. "Please, this can't be happening," Janice murmured, feeling fear build with every piercing sound from the alarms. She clutched her chest, where a heavy, suffocating pressure was starting to form. Desperation overtook her, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. The sound of failing machines felt like a countdown to the worst. "Richard, you have to hold on. You can't leave me now," she whispered, each word an effort to cling to hope. Gradually, her breaths grew heavier, and she felt a familiar tightness in her lungs, as though the air itself refused to enter. It was a feeling she knew too well, a looming asthma attack, threatening to intensify along with her rising panic. "No, not now," she muttered, trying to control her breathing, but the malfunctioning equipment made it feel impossible. She gulped down air, but the panic left her more breathless each time. Sensing Janice's distress, Carolyn placed a hand on her shoulder, attempting to comfort her. "Calm down, Janice. You need to breathe slowly. Try to relax, okay?" she said, trying to maintain her own composure, though her heart was pounding with fear. Janice looked up, her eyes wide, trying to follow Carolyn's advice. But her chest was tightening, her breath becoming more shallow, signaling she was on the edge of a serious attack. I can't breathe," she whispered, her voice barely audible, struggling in vain to keep her fear at bay. Suddenly, a louder alarm echoed down the hall, signaling Richard's condition had worsened. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, adjusting the equipment and trying to stabilize his critical state. Janice watched from a distance, barely able to breathe herself, yet unable to look away. "Richard, you have to fight. You promised me you'd stay." Janice whispered each word faintly, as if even breathing was a struggle. During the peak of her asthma attack, dizziness set in, and the hallway around her seemed to spin. The hurried footsteps of doctors mixed with the hum of machines, blurring everything into a chaotic haze. Trying to focus, she pressed her hand against her chest, desperately forcing air in, but panic was overtaking her. "I need to breathe. I need help," she thought, as her body shook and her vision dimmed. Amid the confusion, Carolyn shouted at a nurse as Janice began to collapse, but just then, a loud explosion echoed through the hospital. Lights flickered before everything was swallowed in darkness. A complete blackout enveloped the building, leaving hallways and surgery rooms without any light source. The machines fell silent, and the heavy darkness magnified everyone's fear. Panic surged, and Janice, lost in the blackness and out of breath, tried to hold onto the bit of air she could, but her body wasn't responding. Emergency lights tried to blink on, but quickly failed as the generators completely shut down. Darkness engulfed Carolyn and Janice, who felt their anxiety grow. Janice's breathing grew shallower, her chest rising and falling wildly as she struggled in vain to calm her asthma attack. "I can't lose air now," she thought, each breath an enormous effort. Soft, hurried footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, and suddenly a gentle hand touched her shoulder. It was a nurse who had somehow managed to locate her in the dark. "Here, take this, honey," the nurse whispered, pressing an inhaler into her hand. Janice held onto it tightly, like a lifeline, and took a dose in the midst of the chaos. Slowly, she began to breathe easier, feeling the air finally filling her lungs. Thank you," she murmured, a glimmer of hope flickering through her crisis. But before she could say more, the nurse was already standing with a serious expression. "I need to get to other patients. We're without power, and many rely on critical equipment," she said urgently, casting one last worried look at Janice and Carolyn before disappearing down the hallway, leaving them alone again. Worry crept over them as they exchanged looks, sharing a silent fear about what they might find in Richard's room. Janice, barely catching her breath, clutched a small toy flashlight she had tucked in her pocket. "Come on, we need to check on him. My grandpa doesn't use machines. But Richard..." "We have to go," she whispered, looking at Carolyn with a determination that was shaky, yet unwavering enough to keep her moving forward. Carolyn's heart was pounding erratically, but she nodded, swallowing down the fear threatening to take over. "Yes, we need to make sure he's okay," she replied, trying to steady her voice as they walked together down the dark hallway. The faint beam from Janice's flashlight wobbled with every step, but it still gave them enough light to make their way toward Richard's room. As they neared the door, the silence from within was almost suffocating. There were no sounds of a ventilator, no rhythmic beeping from monitors. Carolyn felt her heart sink as she tightened her grip on the manual ventilation mask she was holding, bracing herself for the worst. If the ventilators stopped, he might be without air, she murmured to herself, her gaze fixed on the door, trying to summon the courage to step inside. Carolyn took a deep breath, letting instincts and courage she didn't know she had take over. Following her touch and intuition, she carefully positioned the manual ventilation mask over her father's face. Each breath she provided to Richard was a silent battle in the dark, a desperate attempt to keep him alive. Janice held the dim light toward Richard, trying to illuminate his face enough for Carolyn to see what she was doing. In that small beam, there was a flicker of hope. "It's all we've got, but it's enough. I know we can do this," Janice murmured, almost to herself, holding the flashlight tightly in her trembling hands. With each movement, Carolyn matched the rhythm of the manual ventilation, pressing the mask to imitate the breaths that the machine could no longer provide. "Richard, you have to fight. I'm here. I'm right here with you," she whispered, as silent tears slipped down her face, fighting to hold back the growing fear. Each press seemed to take something from her, but Carolyn stood resolute, focused on keeping the oxygen flowing for her father. The room was silent, broken only by the sound of the mask being compressed and released, and Carolyn's unyielding effort to keep Richard breathing. The flashlight's beam wavered slightly as Janice, immersed in her own struggle to help, held steady, feeling a sharp fear clawing at her chest. "Come on, Richard. We're not giving up on you or Grandpa," Janice whispered, trying to keep hope alive for herself and Carolyn. Each passing second intensified their desperation as Carolyn alternated her gaze between her father and Janice, who continued to hold the flashlight with unwavering strength. Carolyn's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay focused on every movement. "He still has a chance. He just needs to fight. Please, Richard, don't give up now," she murmured, feeling the weight of each word settling heavily into her muscles. As time passed, handling the ventilation mask became more challenging. The emotional and physical weight of the moment felt almost unbearable, but Carolyn pressed on, determined not to give up. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and fatigue began to wear on her resolve. "I can't give up. He can't give up," she thought as tears streamed uncontrollably, blurring her vision. Sensing Carolyn's exhaustion, Janice moved closer, keeping the flashlight steady on Richard's face. "Ms. Carolyn, I can help." "I can hold the mask while you rest," Janice offered softly, her voice carrying a kind of bravery that only desperation could grant. Carolyn hesitated, looking at the young girl with surprise and understanding, but shook her head. "No, I can't take that chance. He needs air now, and I need to keep going." As the effort became almost unbearable, Carolyn felt her heartbeat quicken, her movements with the ventilator growing faster and more desperate. "Please, Richard, hear me. You have to keep breathing. Don't leave me like this," she whispered, her voice finally surrendering to despair. Just then, after what felt like an eternity in darkness, the hospital lights flickered, dim at first, then steadier. As though the system were unsure if it could resume its function, the lights in Richard's room flickered, slowly growing brighter until they filled the space completely. Carolyn and Janice exchanged relieved glances, each feeling a brief moment of hope. "The lights are back, Richard," Carolyn murmured, trying to hold on to the belief that this small victory meant everything would turn out fine. But their relief was short-lived. Moments later, the door swung open, and a nurse rushed in, breathing heavily and bringing distressing news. "Arthur, Janice's grandfather, she gasped. He's taken a sudden turn and needs immediate attention. We're doing everything we can. But it's not looking good, she added, her concerned eyes fixed on the young girl. Janice felt a chill run down her spine. No, he was getting better. He survived the surgery, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Tears welled up in her eyes, her heart sinking under the weight of this new crisis. She looked at Carolyn with desperation, feeling an overwhelming urge to help in any way she could. I need to be with him, Miss Carolyn. I need to see my grandfather, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Carolyn nodded, understanding the girl's anguish, even as her own heart felt torn between Richard and Arthur. Go, Janice. I'll stay here with my father, she said, giving the girl's hand a reassuring squeeze. He'll be all right. We have to believe that, Carolyn whispered, almost to herself. As Janice hurried off to be with her grandfather, Carolyn shifted her full focus back to Richard. The hospital's backup system was struggling to keep things going, each second feeling like it teetered on a fragile edge. Richard's respirator was operating, but only in fits and starts, forcing Carolyn to stay on high alert, ready to take over with manual ventilation if needed. Fatigue swept over her, but she refused to let herself feel weak. Dad, you can't leave me now. I need you to keep fighting, please, she whispered, each word etched with fear. Out in the hall, Janice made her way to the room where Arthur was being treated. Inside, the doctors were working with intense focus, doing everything they could to turn things around. Janice stopped at the door, hands clasped together in silent prayer, holding her breath as she watched the medical team battle for her grandfather's life. Grandpa, you promised you'd stay with me. Don't give up now, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She closed her eyes, as if her silent prayer could reach him, lending him strength to hold on just a little longer. Arthur's condition seemed to be worsening, and the medical team exchanged tense glances, fully aware they were facing near impossible odds. The monitors hummed, machines flickered, and for a moment, Arthur's vital signs took a sudden drop. One of the doctors rushed over to adjust the settings, and Janice shrank back, feeling despair grip her heart. No, not him too, she whispered, her hands trembling. In Richard's room, she noticed her father's respirator beginning to sound an alert. Once again, the equipment seemed on the brink of failure. Without hesitation, she grabbed the manual ventilation mask, taking over his breathing with steady determination. Each push on the mask was both a physical and emotional effort, but she wouldn't stop. Dad, I'm right here. Please don't leave me now. I can't lose you, she whispered, timing each breath with the beat of her own heart. The hospital lights flickered again, and she feared the power would go out completely. But at that moment, she felt there was no room to give up. In this fragile moment, it seemed like she and Richard were closer than ever. Each press of the mask was a silent prayer, a promise that he could still make it back. Dad, I know your chances are slim, but I believe in miracles. We're going to save you. We have to. After what felt like an eternity of shadow and uncertainty, the hospital lights flickered, dim and unsteady, as if the power still hadn't fully returned. In Richard's room, the flickering light revealed his pale, motionless face, while the monitors around him beeped erratically. Carolyn held his hand, feeling the coldness of his skin against hers. The mechanical sounds around them felt like an echo of an inevitable verdict. Each time the monitor skipped a beat, she felt a weight in her chest, as if her own breath was being taken away. Dad, I'm here with you. Please, come back. I am aware that you never desired to live on machines. I know you wanted to live, not merely survive. But how can I go on without you? Don't leave me, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. Carolyn understood how critical Richard's condition was, yet the thought of losing him was unimaginable. You're strong. Please keep fighting, she murmured, trying to send him a thread of hope, though hers was quickly unraveling. Just then, the door opened, and the doctor stepped in. His face was serious, his eyes holding a somber compassion. Carolyn felt the weight of the moment, realizing he bore a difficult decision. He approached her, his expression conveying the severity of the situation. "Miss Carolyn, we need to talk about your father's condition," he said gently. Carolyn pressed her lips together, feeling a wave of anger that nearly suffocated her. "Doctor, please, do everything you can to save him. To bring him back," she implored, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. The doctor paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "Your father is in a vegetative state, and his health is extremely fragile. His vital signs are unstable, and it's a very critical situation. Without immediate intervention, he won't make it much longer. But even with the surgery, there's only a 2% chance he'll survive, and he may not wake up from the coma." Each word felt like a blow. Carolyn felt her world collapsing around her, trying to process the news, searching for any fragment of hope where there seemed to be none. 2% was all that was left, a sliver of hope. How can I make such a decision? If that's his only chance, then do the surgery. He deserves that chance. I don't care if it's 2%, 1%, or a fraction of a chance. As long as we can, fight for him, she said, forcing herself to sound resolute. The doctor looked at her with understanding eyes, though his expression grew more serious. "I want you to understand the risks. The surgery has only a 2% success rate. He may not survive it," he said carefully. "Isn't there any other option?" she asked, desperately searching for an alternative that wasn't so devastating. But the doctor simply shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. Without the surgery, he won't survive much longer, and even with it, there are significant risks, especially given the unstable power situation. If there's another outage during the procedure..." "The odds are almost zero," he explained, his voice heavy with the hard truth that Carolyn now had to face. The choice felt impossible, yet Carolyn knew she couldn't just let go. She clung to her father's hand, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered. It was the last sign of life, connecting her to him. "Dad, I don't know if this is the right choice, but I can't give up on you," she thought, as tears finally began to trace down her face. The image of her father, always so strong and present, was now slipping into a fragile memory, and she knew she had to fight, no matter the cost. Carolyn looked at the doctor, trying to summon the courage to respond. "I understand the risks, doctor, but he deserves that chance, however small." Her voice, though shaking, held firm. The doctor nodded, a mix of respect and concern in his expression. "Then we'll prepare for surgery, but please be ready for any outcome," he said, gently placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. With his condition and the limits of what the hospital could do, he couldn't promise things would turn out the way they hoped. "Take a moment to say goodbye," he advised, his tone a quiet warning. Carolyn felt the weight of responsibility and uncertainty bearing down on her. Each word the doctor spoke seemed like a caution, preparing her for the worst, but she refused to yield to fear. "I know, but he's strong, and I have to believe he can make it. Please, just do everything you can," she responded, convincing herself her choice wasn't just stubbornness. As the doctor left to prepare for surgery, Carolyn leaned over Richard, gripping his hand even tighter. "Dad, I know you can fight. You're strong, and I'll be here, waiting for you," she whispered, her gaze locked on his face, as if her words could reach the depths of his consciousness and keep him holding on. The unsteady sound of the machines was a constant reminder of the danger, but she chose to block it out, focusing instead on the promise she'd just made. She would stay by his side until the last moment, pushing back the fear and holding on to even the slightest bit of hope. The cold, white light of the surgical room seemed to intensify the weight of it all. Dr. Murray stared at the monitors tracking Richard's intracranial pressure, which was rising to dangerous levels. Every second felt like a test, and the team knew even the slightest misstep could turn the surgery into a battle lost before it began. We have to be ready. Every detail matters now, he thought, fully aware that even a minor mistake could seal Richard's fate. From the waiting room, Carolyn watched, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. Through the small window, she could see the medical team moving with precision, adjusting each tool and triple-checking every setup. The glass between her and the operating room felt like an unbridgeable gap, a barrier that prevented her from helping her father when he needed her most. "He needs me, and all I can do is watch," she murmured, feeling powerless and frustrated as she gripped the edge of her seat tightly. As the doctors meticulously prepared the surgical environment, Carolyn drifted into childhood memories. She remembered her father as a strong, invincible man who never backed down from a challenge. Now, he lay there, vulnerable and fragile, at the mercy of a situation that no amount of money or influence could fix. "Please, Dad, you were always my strength. I need you to fight for me," she thought, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she watched him surrounded by machines. Inside, Dr. Murray coordinated with his team, each member taking strategic positions and reviewing the procedure. Richard's neurosurgery was one of the most challenging and delicate procedures they had ever undertaken. The nurses readied an array of instruments, forceps, scalpels, probes, and other tools essential for the operation. Each movement was carried out with precision, like a carefully choreographed dance, where a single misstep could be fatal. "We have to be prepared for anything. No mistakes," Dr. Murray reminded, keeping his team focused and steady despite the tension visible on every face. On the other side of the glass, Carolyn watched every detail, her anxiety growing by the minute. Seeing Richard, always her protector, now so vulnerable and dependent on the doctors, was nearly unbearable. "He's always been my shield, and now he's the one who needs help," she whispered, hands clenched in a silent prayer, feeling torn between hope and despair. The quiet in the waiting room seemed to amplify her suffering, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The medical team adjusted the monitors, which displayed dangerously erratic shifts in Richard's intracranial pressure. The nurses exchanged glances, fully aware that the slightest mistake could trigger a complete breakdown. Dr. Murray kept his eyes locked on the readings, each second demanding his full concentration. He understood this was a race against time, one that required him to act swiftly, yet with exact precision. "We'll do everything we can to keep him stable, but we have no margin for error. There's only a 2% chance," he warned, his voice calm but firm. The tension in the waiting room thickened, and each passing second felt like an eternity. She knew Richard's fate rested in the medical team's hands, and the helplessness of simply waiting was agonizing. "I need to be strong for him, like he's always been for me," she thought, memories of her father filling her with a fragile hope. But fear crept in, threatening to overwhelm her resolve. Would she have the strength to get through this? Suddenly, Dr. Murray noticed an even sharper spike on the monitors, his gaze tightening as an emergency unfolded. Richard's body began to twist in violent spasms, a severe seizure taking over with terrifying force. "I need help here now," shouted Dr. Murray. He and the team rushed to stabilize Richard, working urgently to contain the seizure before irreversible damage occurred. Behind the glass, Carolyn watched her father's body tremble uncontrollably, and despair washed over her. Her legs felt weak, and her heart raced unevenly as she tried to grasp what was happening. "Not now, please. Not after all of this," she murmured, her hands covering her mouth as she watched helplessly. Dr. Murray handled the instruments with precision, and the air around him charged with tension and urgency. Everyone was operating at peak focus, their eyes glued to the monitors and to Richard's vital signs, which were as delicate as a tightrope on the verge of snapping. "We have to keep him stable, no matter what. We can't lose control now," Dr. Murray murmured, his voice barely audible amid his intense concentration. Meanwhile, the anesthesiologist, positioned beside Richard, kept a sharp eye on the vital signs, knowing that even the slightest fluctuation could put the patient at serious risk. Any misstep at this moment was simply unacceptable. Suddenly the numbers started to drop, and the anesthesiologist's brow furrowed. "Dr. Murray, we're seeing instability in the vitals. We need to adjust the anesthesia, or he could become unstable," the anesthesiologist warned, voice tense yet steady as he tried to keep Richard as stable as possible. Outside, Carolyn waited. Her hands were clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the clock, as if every second crawled by, slower than the last. She knew her father was under the care of a highly skilled team, but the fear of losing someone so dear hung over her like a constant shadow. "Dad, please, you have to pull through," she whispered to herself, fighting back tears that kept threatening to spill. Inside the operating room, Dr. Murray and his team moved cautiously. Every action was executed with surgical precision, a dance of expertise in a setting that felt almost unbearable. Through the magnification of the microscope, Dr. Murray could see the extent of the bleeding, but he quickly noticed something concerning. "We have more blood than anticipated. This makes it harder to access the aneurysm," he said, his expression growing serious as the nurses around him exchanged worried glances. Realizing that the bleeding was more severe than expected, put everyone on high alert. Dr. Murray's hands, though steady, tensed as he paused momentarily to evaluate the best approach. "Every second counts. We can't stop now. We need access to..." His voice conveyed the gravity of the situation. The anesthesiologist continued monitoring closely, adjusting doses with careful precision. "We're at the limit. Any change, and he could destabilize," he murmured, his voice low but laden with concern. In the waiting room, Carolyn felt as if she were trapped in an endless nightmare. Every passing minute seemed like an eternity, and the silence around her was overwhelming. She remembered all the times her father had encouraged her to stay strong and resilient in the face of challenges. Now, she prayed that he could find that same strength within himself. "I know you can get through this, Dad. You're stronger than anyone could ever imagine," she thought, clinging to that last strand of hope. Inside the operating room, Dr. Murray proceeded with the intricate procedure, carefully maneuvering to avoid complications. Any extra pressure might worsen the situation, making it nearly impossible to access the aneurysm. He moved the scalpel with extreme precision while the team held their breath, fully aware that the slightest misstep could be catastrophic. "More suction here. Visibility is poor," he instructed, his firm voice carrying a sense of urgency that only heightened the tension in the room. Time pressed on, and the medical team fought against it. Each move Dr. Murray made was calculated and exact, with the assistants maintaining a controlled environment despite the increasing risk of failure. From outside, Carolyn watched the doctor's every move through the glass, her gaze searching for her father's face, knowing he lay unconscious. "He has to win this battle. I can't bear to lose him," she thought, holding on to memories of him, encouraging her to be strong and to never give up. Suddenly, Richard's vital signs began fluctuating on the monitor. The anesthetist glanced at Dr. Murray, her expression tense. "We're losing stability on his vitals. His pressure is spiking," she warned, working swiftly to stabilize Richard. Dr. Murray exhaled deeply, fully aware that each passing second made the operation riskier. "Keep monitoring. We need to reach the aneurysm before things worsen," he directed. The team nodded in silent understanding, knowing the precision the task required. Just as Dr. Murray approached the aneurysm, he realized it was even more severe than expected. He adjusted his position, advancing with utmost care, aware that any additional pressure might cause an irreparable rupture. "This is the critical moment. We need to stay calm and precise," he said, as everyone held their breath. As he carefully positioned the instrument to engage the aneurysm, a sharp beep echoed from the monitor, signaling yet another shift in Richard's vitals. The anesthetist made a desperate attempt to stabilize him, but it was clear they were reaching their limits. "Dr. Murray, his vitals are dropping low. I'm not sure how much longer he can hold on," the anesthetist warned, heightening the focus in the room. Outside, Carolyn, his aunt, watched every movement with a blend of desperation and hope. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but sensed that this was a crucial moment. "Please, Dad. Don't leave now, please." She whispered a prayer, clinging to a thin thread of hope, as everything around her seemed on the verge of collapsing. "God, I beg you, don't take him." Inside the operating room, Dr. Murray made one last attempt to reach the aneurysm, his hands precise as he straddled a line between success and failure. As he adjusted his tool to control the aneurysm, a rush of red flooded the surgical field. The aneurysm had burst during the procedure, intensifying the already charged atmosphere in the OR. Dr. Murray kept his focus on the surgical field, his hands moving with careful precision, each motion deliberate and controlled. After hours of painstaking work, he had finally visualized the aneurysm, a small, threatening bulge in the delicate web of blood vessels. With each beat, the aneurysm seemed to taunt him, as if ready to break under its own fragile weight. "It's now or never," he thought, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Around him, the medical team stood still, almost holding their breath, awaiting his next instruction. The assistants prepared the materials needed to contain the aneurysm. Each move was choreographed in perfect sync. "We need calm and precision. One mistake, and everything falls apart," murmured Dr. Murray, more to himself than anyone else. He focused on keeping his hands steady, though the risk was overwhelming. Across the room, the anesthetist monitored the screen closely, fully aware that any sudden change in Richard's vitals could be a critical warning sign. The intracranial pressure is still elevated, but holding steady, he reported in a voice that was calm, yet tense. Richard's pressure fluctuated wildly, spiking and dipping, as if his body were fighting a silent battle against time. "We don't have much time, Dr. Murray. We need to move quickly," he urged, casting a worried look at the surgeon. Dr. Murray was fully aware of how crucial every second was, feeling the weight of urgency in his colleague's tone. He took a deep breath, refocusing and pushing aside any distractions. "Let's proceed. Keep the area as clear as possible, no interruptions," he instructed, as he prepared himself for the next critical step. With precise, almost surgical focus, he began, knowing that even a slight misstep could have fatal consequences. "One step at a time," he reminded himself, struggling to keep his hand from trembling. Meanwhile, Carolyn waited in the hallway, oblivious to the technical details of the surgery, but painfully aware of the life-threatening danger her father faced. Each passing minute seemed to intensify the weight she bore. Only the sound of the clock ticking in the hospital corridor broke the silence, each tick serving as a harsh reminder of her helplessness. She clenched her hands, her gaze fixed on the small window of the operating room door, as though she could see through the walls. "You've been through so much already, Dad. This will just be another hurdle," she whispered, caught between despair and hope. Inside, Dr. Murray proceeded, every movement deliberate and controlled. As he neared a critical point, a faint tremor went through him. He knew he had completed the riskiest part, but the job was far from over. "Secure the aneurysm. Now we need to stabilize the field and check for any leaks," he said, his voice laced with contained determination. The clip was in place, yet he understood that any flaw could lead to a relapse. The anesthesiologist, closely monitoring Richard's vital signs, exhaled in slight relief as the levels began to stabilize. "The pressure is dropping, but we still need to keep a close watch," he cautioned, eyes fixed intently on the monitors. A moment of quiet settled over the room, a small victory. Though everyone understood the situation remained critical. Dr. Murray gave a nod, but his focus remained on the surgical field. "We're almost there. Just a few more steps," he thought, doing his best to stay calm. Carolyn, standing just outside, watched the doctor's movements through the glass, her anxiety growing with each passing second. Time seemed to drag on, each moment stretching between hope and dread. Her father's words echoed in her mind, urging her to be strong and to never give up. "Please, God, I just need one miracle," she whispered, as silent tears traced down her cheeks. She clutched the crucifix around her neck, trying to hold on to any shred of strength she could find. Inside the operating room, the team moved with flawless synchronization, double-checking the containment points around the aneurysm to make sure everything was secure. Dr. Murray motioned for them to adjust the lighting, preparing to make one final check. The operation had gone well technically, but he knew there was still a long way to go for a complete recovery. "The critical phase is over. Now, it's a matter of stabilizing and monitoring," he said, allowing himself a slight sigh of relief. The anesthesiologist watched Richard's vital signs, which had now settled into a more controlled rhythm. "He's stable, for now," he remarked, though there was still a cautious edge to his voice. Though relieved, the entire team remained aware that Richard's condition was fragile, and any slip could undo their progress. Dr. Murray looked at his patient, feeling the weight of responsibility lingering. "I've done my part. The rest is up to you, Richard," he thought, with hopeful resolve. After wrapping up the procedure, the team prepared Richard for transfer to the ICU, where he would be closely monitored. Dr. Murray removed his surgical gloves, the sound of the latex peeling away echoing softly in the room, a small but definitive end to one of the most tense procedures of his career. The risk of complications was still high, but now all he could do was wait. The procedure was successful, but we'll see if he remains in a coma. "We'll be monitoring his vitals closely," he explained to the team, his tone professional but with a hint of relief. Carolyn, watching from outside, felt a fleeting sense of comfort as she saw the team begin clearing the room, a sign that the operation was finally over. When Dr. Murray stepped out to deliver the news, she stood up quickly, her heart racing. "Doctor, is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of empathy. "We managed to control the aneurysm, but we still have to see if he'll wake up from the coma. His condition is delicate, and now we need time and patience," he explained. Carolyn felt a wave of emotions flooding over her. She nodded, trying to process what this meant. Her father was alive, but there was still a long journey ahead. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for not giving up," she murmured, her voice wavering as she felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. The hospital room's soft lighting cast a glow over Arthur's weary face. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the brightness, and he seemed confused, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Janice, seated beside his bed, watched his every tiny movement, her heart pounding. When he finally opened his eyes and looked at her, a rush of relief and emotion overcame her. "Dad, you're awake," she whispered, holding his hands tightly, afraid he might disappear any second. Arthur tried to smile, though his face was pale and tired. "My little one, where are we? What happened?" he murmured, his voice weak but filled with love. Janice swallowed, feeling the weight of recent events pressing on her shoulders. She knew she had to tell him everything, but the words felt tangled up inside her. Dad. It was all so terrifying. I'd never been so scared, she admitted, her voice shaking slightly as she looked at him. Taking a deep breath, she began to explain, her heart still racing with the memories of what had just happened. How do I even begin to tell you everything? Well, I saw you needed your medicine, so I went out to sell flowers to buy more. I stood out there on the street, trying my best to sell whatever I could to get the money for your meds. But nobody would help. The rain was pouring down, and no one was stopping. Janice sat beside her grandfather, Arthur, as she tried to explain the events. Then I met this man. Richard, she began, noticing how her grandfather watched her intently, his expression somber as he absorbed every word, trying to grasp the gravity of what had happened. He was wealthy, but he helped me, she continued, gratitude in her voice. He bought all the flowers, and when I told him you weren't well, he came with me to help you and asked his driver to bring us here. Arthur's eyes filled with emotion as he processed Richard's actions. He did all that for us, and he didn't even know us, he asked, his voice low and filled with astonishment. Janice nodded, trying to explain how this stranger had become such a meaningful presence. Yes, Grandpa, he didn't even know me, but he cared about you, and later, he needed help too. His surgery was today, she added, feeling her throat tighten as she remembered all that Richard had risked for them. She took a deep breath, struggling to convey the fear she had felt. It was awful, Grandpa. Seeing you there, unresponsive, and then finding out Richard was in danger too. I felt like I was going to lose you both at the same time. A single tear escaped down her cheek, and Arthur reached out with a shaky hand, gently wiping it away. My girl, you were braver than anyone could know. I couldn't be prouder of you, he murmured, his voice filled with pride and love. She tried to smile, but the weight of everything still hung heavy on her heart. I just wish it could have all been different. I wanted you to be okay from the beginning, and I didn't want Richard to get hurt because of me, she murmured, almost as if blaming herself. Arthur shook his head gently, trying to reassure her. No, my dear. What he did was a choice made by a kind heart. He saw something special in you, just as I do. Never blame yourself for that, he said, his gaze warm and steady. Janice nodded, attempting to take her grandfather's words to heart, though she still felt torn between gratitude and guilt. I just want to thank him. For everything he did, she said softly, her gaze drifting toward the door, as though hoping Richard might walk through it. Arthur squeezed her hand again, with the affectionate strength only a grandfather could offer. You'll have that chance. I'm sure he'll recover, he assured her, his calm confidence bringing a bit of peace to her heart. Just then, Carolyn entered the room, looking exhausted, but offering a faint smile. Janice looked at Carolyn with hopeful eyes, and Carolyn gave a nod, silently answering the girl's unspoken question. The surgery is done. Your father's been moved to his room, and now we just need time and patience, she explained, trying to reassure both Janice and Arthur. The days crept by, each one filled with anticipation and tension. After a series of tests, Arthur received news he was ready to go home, but to everyone's surprise, he refused to be discharged immediately. I can't leave now. I need to stay by Richard's side until the end, he stated, his determination earning a nod of respect from the doctor. Carolyn, Janice, and the others understood what compelled Arthur. Richard wasn't just some wealthy stranger to them. He was a man who had risked everything for Arthur and Janice. Richard's hospital room had become a meeting place for all who were anxiously waiting for a sign, any small movement indicating he was coming back to them. Each morning, Arthur would sit by Richard's bed and share a story. Let me tell you about the day my granddaughter Janice and I planted sunflowers in the yard. She was so young, and we had to wait months before we saw the first sprout break through, he'd say, holding Richard's hand like that of an old friend. Everything has its time, my friend. I know you'll find yours too, he murmured, as if his words could stir Richard from his sleep. Janice spent much of her day at the hospital, sitting by her grandfather as he waited, endlessly patient. You know, Grandpa, Richard's kind of like our sunflowers, isn't he? It's like he's just waiting for the right moment to show up, she'd say, attempting a smile. Arthur would nod, smiling back at his granddaughter with a gentle look. Yes, sweetheart. I think he just needs a bit more sunshine, he'd reply, holding Janice's hand, trying to pass on the same faith. Every day brought a new story, another shared memory. Carolyn, more reserved, watched everything in quiet contemplation, feeling a constant tightness in her chest. She could see how deeply these people appreciated her father and how much his kindness had touched their lives. He'd never told her about what he'd done for Arthur and Janice. She'd never known the quiet kindness he showed to others, feeling a pang of regret for not seeing that side of him sooner. But as the days drifted by, Carolyn began to notice that Richard remained still, his face peaceful, yet distant. Each story shared was like a seed of hope planted in her heart, but with every day of silence that hope seemed to grow fainter. Dad, what are you waiting for? We're all here, waiting for you to come back, she whispered, holding his hand, feeling the weight of the choice before her. Arthur, though fragile, kept his promise of daily visits. Helly and Janice always brought little mementos to brighten the room, flowers or small drawings made by Janice. Here, Richard, we brought a flower from the garden. I know you can't see it, but I think you'll like the scent, Arthur said, setting the tiny bloom beside Richard's bed. He hoped that one day, if Richard ever opened his eyes, he would see everything they had done for him. One evening, Carolyn sat alone in the room with Richard. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the machines monitoring his heartbeat. She gazed at her father, her heart tightening with the thought she had tried to avoid for days. She knew he had always been firm in his beliefs, a man who valued his dignity above all. Dad, you always told me you hated the idea of relying on others. You couldn't stand the thought of being tied to a bed, she whispered, her voice trembling. She realized she might be nearing an inevitable decision. With each visit, the once bright hope began to fade. Every time she came to see him, Carolyn observed her father in the same state, motionless, giving no sign of awareness. His face held a calm expression, but also a faraway look, as if he were in a place too distant to hear or feel anything around him. Maybe he's at peace. Maybe he's already gone, though his body is still here, she thought, feeling a heavy ache in her chest. Arthur noticed her sorrow and offered a gentle reassurance. You know, life has a way of surprising us. I've seen people come back when all hope seemed lost. Maybe Richard will surprise us too, Arthur said, trying to keep the mood hopeful. Carolyn forced a smile, appreciating his optimism, though deep down her heart still held on to doubt. Thank you, Arthur, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on to that hope, she replied, each word weighed down by her own exhaustion. In recent visits, Carolyn could no longer hide the tiredness and worry etched in her expression. Even Janice, the eternal optimist, had started to wonder if Richard would ever wake up. Grandpa, do you think Richard is just sleeping a lot, or maybe he's already gone and we just don't know it yet? She asked innocently, holding her grandfather's hand tightly. Arthur stroked his granddaughter's hair, uncertain how to respond. I don't know, sweetheart. Despite his own doubts, he said, but I do know his heart is still with us, and that's what matters. One evening, alone by Richard's side, Carolyn felt the burden of a decision pressing down on her almost unbearably. Sitting beside his bed, she held her father's hand, looking closely at his unmoving face. "Father, you always taught me to be strong, to make the tough choices. But how can I let you go?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She knew she might only be prolonging the pain for both of them. With a heavy heart, Carolyn made her choice. She stood up and looked at her father one last time, as though seeking some confirmation or sign to change her mind, but only silence answered her. "I'm going to honor what I believe you would have wanted, what you always told me," she murmured, letting the tears fall freely at last. The next day, the room's silence felt heavy and unrelenting. Every beep from the monitors sounded like a grim reminder that Richard's time was slipping away. Carolyn, Arthur, and Janice gathered around the bed, their expressions reflecting the weight of the moment. Carolyn took a deep breath, trying to summon strength, though the ache in her chest made it hard to find words. "Dad, we're here. We came to be with you, to tell you how much you mean to us," she began, her voice barely a whisper, as though she didn't want to disturb the delicate quiet. She held his hand, his cold fingers intertwined with hers. Arthur watched, feeling a deep sadness inside. He had only known Richard briefly, but the sacrifice Richard made had left a mark on him that words could never fully capture. "Richard, I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know how deeply grateful I am. You've changed our lives. Because of you, I still get to see my granddaughter's smile every day." I whisper, trying to keep my emotions steady. Janice, with tear-filled eyes, held a small bouquet she had brought, as if it were a farewell gift. "Richard, you were like a hero to me," she whispered, clutching the bouquet to her chest. "I wish you could see how much you've inspired me. These flowers are for you. They're the best I have, and I hope you feel how much you've touched me." She placed the bouquet carefully by the bed, fighting back tears that had already begun to stream down her face. She glanced over at her father, her heart heavy, knowing she needed to say words she never had the courage to say before. "Dad, you were always more than you seemed. Your unyielding strength in business, your sacrifices, everything you did for us, for me. I never thanked you enough," she murmured, her voice breaking. She knew this might be the last moment to express her feelings. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize sooner how amazing you were," she continued, letting her tears finally fall. Time seemed to slow as they all stayed there, each absorbed in their own quiet goodbyes. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment as if in silent prayer, hoping for a miracle, a chance for Richard. "We didn't want it to end this way, my friend, but if this is your time, go peacefully, knowing you've left a mark on all of us," Arthur whispered, squeezing Carolyn's shoulder, who grew even more emotional. Janice looked steadily at Richard, her young eyes trying to grasp the gravity of the moment. She wished more than anything that he would just wake up, open his eyes, and honor them with his presence once more. "Richard, if you can hear me, please come back. We're not ready to say goodbye," the little girl murmured, her voice trembling, her face still damp with tears as she reached out and touched his arm, hoping that her simple touch might awaken him. Carolyn, still clutching her father's hand, felt a tightness in her chest as the realization sank in. Richard remained motionless. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavy and unyielding. She wished desperately that things could be different, that he would be there, comforting her as he always had. Her voice barely above a whisper, she felt like a child, hoping for something she knew might never happen. She lowered her head, a shadow of deep sadness veiling her face. The silence was broken only by the steady beeping of the machines, each sound echoing through the room, a stark reminder of the fragile state of things. Arthur and Janice stepped closer, trying to console Carolyn with their presence, though words felt inadequate to express the depth of their emotions. "We're here with you, Carolyn. He'll always be in our hearts no matter what happens," Arthur said, as Janice nodded quietly, gently taking Carolyn's hand in a gesture of support. Carolyn exhaled, her chest aching with the pain of a goodbye that was becoming all too real. She gazed at her father, memorizing each detail of his face, every line, every mark. "I don't know if I'm ready to let you go, Dad. But maybe it's what you want," she murmured, as silent tears traced down her cheeks. The decision loomed over her, drawing closer with an unforgiving sense of finality. Then, in the midst of the sadness and farewells, something almost imperceptible happened. Carolyn felt a faint movement beneath her fingers, a slight tremor in Richard's hand. She opened her eyes, hardly daring to believe what she felt. "Dad, was that you?" she whispered, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of it. Sensing a shift in Carolyn's expression, Arthur and Janice moved closer, their faces filled with hope and disbelief. "Did he move?" "Carolyn, is that what you felt?" Arthur asked, his face lighting up with surprise and expectation. Carolyn nodded, still in shock, her gaze fixed on her father's hand as if willing it to move again. Janice, filled with emotion, gently took Richard's arm, her voice brimming with hope. "Richard, are you there? Can you hear us?" she whispered, almost like a prayer. Richard's eyes slowly fluttered open, blinking a few times as if emerging from a long, deep sleep. The room felt hushed, and the soft overhead light seemed to gently illuminate him as he woke. Around him, Carolyn, Arthur, and Janice watched anxiously, their eyes reflecting both relief and a hint of anticipation. Carolyn held his hand gently, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Dad, are you awake?" she whispered, a shaky smile forming on her face, as though she were living a dream that had finally come true. Richard slowly opened his eyes, blinking several times, as if the soft light in the hospital room was bothering him. He looked around, his gaze filled with confusion, as though he were in an entirely unfamiliar place. His brow furrowed as he took in the faces surrounding him, a deep emptiness mirrored in his eyes. Carolyn, noticing her father's hesitation and lost expression, felt a wave of both relief and fear. She leaned closer, her voice hopeful. "Dad, are you here? Have you come back to us?" she whispered, waiting for him to react. Yet Richard continued to stare at her, his eyes slightly narrowed but with no recognition. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, then shook his head slightly, as if attempting to clear a fog from his mind. Where am I? Who are you?" His voice was low and hoarse, each word sounding heavy, laden with puzzling doubt. Carolyn felt her blood run cold upon hearing those words, a feeling of despair creeping over her. "Dad, it's me, Carolyn, your daughter," she said, her voice trembling as she tried to reach some spark of memory in him. But Richard kept looking at her like a stranger, making her heart sink further. I don't remember. I don't know who you are. I don't know where I am," he murmured, his voice heavy with increasing confusion. Seeing Richard's condition, Arthur placed a comforting hand on Carolyn's shoulder, then stepped closer to the bed, speaking in a gentle, cautious tone. "Richard, we're your friends. You helped my granddaughter Janice," he said, almost as if he were recounting a story. Yet Richard turned his gaze away, his face bearing the look of someone trapped in the midst of a nightmare. I can't remember," he replied, his tone lost and disoriented. Janice, standing beside her grandfather, felt her expression shift from surprise to sadness as she listened to Richard say he couldn't remember anyone. She looked at Carolyn, her eyes full of questions and fears. "He doesn't remember," Nada whispered softly to her grandmother as the weight of the situation began to sink into her heart. Arthur, noticing the confusion on Richard's face, tried to lighten the mood, giving him a friendly smile, as if they had known each other forever. "Stay calm. You've just had surgery, but you're doing fine now," he said, attempting to keep his tone light. Richard, however, only looked back at him with a puzzled expression, as though he had no idea who this man was speaking to him so eagerly. I don't know where I am," Richard murmured, his voice shaky and uncertain. He glanced around the room again, as if he were in a strange place, surrounded by faces he couldn't recognize. Janice, who was watching with wide, worried eyes, nervously grabbed Carolyn's hand. "Why isn't he remembering?" she whispered, trying to understand what was happening. Carolyn felt her heart race, a rising panic taking hold. "Dad, please, it's me, your daughter Carolyn. Do you remember?" She squeezed his hand tighter, hoping somehow to spark a memory, a connection. But Richard continued to look at her with a blank expression, as if she were a total stranger. I don't remember. I don't know who I am," he confessed, the confusion in his voice hinting at the fear beginning to take over. At that moment, Arthur realized the seriousness of the situation and ran to the door to call for a doctor. "We need help in here. Something's wrong with him," he shouted urgently. Carolyn held onto her father's hand, her eyes filling with tears as she tried to process what this meant. He was so close, yet now seemed so distant from them, she thought, her heart heavy with pain and despair. Moments later, a doctor entered the room, followed by a team of nurses who quickly moved in to check Richard's vital signs. "Mr. Richard, I'm here to help you. Do you know your name?" the doctor asked, keeping his tone calm and reassuring. But Richard only shook his head, his gaze distant. I don't know where I am, or who I am." "Who are these people?" he murmured, gesturing toward Carolyn, Arthur and Janice. The response was like a knife to Carolyn's heart. Seeing her father, the man who had always been her rock, now so vulnerable and unable to recognize her, was something she had never imagined facing. "Dad, please try to remember. Anything. I'm your daughter. I'm your family." Her voice trembled through her tears, but Richard only looked away, unable to recognize the love and anguish pouring out of her. The doctor gestured to the nurses to adjust the monitors around Richard, then approached Carolyn. "These symptoms can be normal after a procedure like his," he explained in a steady, professional tone. "The memory loss may be temporary, but we need time to assess." Carolyn tried to steady herself, but the thought that her father might never return to the man she once knew was deeply unsettling. Arthur, who had been quietly watching, felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. He couldn't imagine someone as strong as Richard reduced to a shadow of himself. "Richard, you'll pull through this. You'll remember. Everything will be okay," he said, attempting to offer some comfort. But Richard only looked away, as if those words held no meaning for him. "No, it won't be okay," he whispered, voice low and tinged with anguish. "I don't remember." Janice, still holding her grandfather's hand, stared at him with wide eyes, unable to understand how he could forget everything. "You're our hero, Richard. You were the one who helped me. How could you not remember?" she said, her voice shaking. But instead of responding, Richard simply stared at her, lost in a sea of confusion. The doctors assessed the situation and decided to sedate Richard temporarily, hoping to ease his anxiety and give the team a chance to plan the next steps. As she watched the medication take effect, Carolyn saw her father's eyes close, this time into a calm, induced sleep. Gerardo, struggling to see the man who had always been his pillar, now so vulnerable, sighed heavily. He wasn't ready to give up. "I won't give up on you, Dad," he whispered, holding his hand gently. "I'll do whatever it takes." As Richard slept, Carolyn remained by his side, recalling memories from her own childhood. Small moments she hoped would one day unlock her father's lost memories. As he finally began to stir awake, she moved closer, ready to try anything that might bring a flicker of familiarity back to him. His eyes opened slowly, with the same initial confusion, though this time he seemed a bit calmer. He looked at her, and she took the chance to start speaking, as if they were having an everyday chat. "Dad, do you remember the house where I grew up?" she started, keeping her tone light like a nostalgic conversation. "It was a small place with a wooden porch where you'd put potted flowers. I'd always help you take care of them, remember?" Richard looked at her, a mix of confusion and curiosity in his eyes. "Flowers porch," he muttered, his voice uncertain. But it was as if something in his mind was trying to reach out to the picture she'd painted. Carolyn smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "Yes, Dad. You always said that flowers needed care and patience, and that they had to be given time. I think that was the first lesson you taught me about patience." She continued in a gentle tone, hoping each word was like a puzzle piece he could piece together. She saw his expression soften a bit, though he still seemed like he was struggling to grasp something through a thick fog. "You'd say that if we cared for the flowers with love, they'd grow strong, and in spring our porch would burst with color. It was our favorite spot. Remember?" she pressed, watching his reaction closely. Richard blinked slowly, as though he was trying to see through a smudged window. "Flowers, colors. It feels familiar, but I'm not sure," he murmured. And Carolyn felt her heart lift with hope, even though he still felt distant. Determined to continue, Carolyn shifted to another memory, trying to draw him closer. "Dad, what about our walks in the park? You'd take me there every Sunday. We'd bring a basket with fruit, and I'd chase the ducks while you'd laugh and call me back," she said, smiling at the memory. "You'd say I had the energy of 10 kids, and that one day you'd need an engine to keep up with me," she added, laughing a little, hoping it would bring a smile to his face too. Richard frowned, as if the sound of her laughter had stirred a distant memory, a faint echo in his mind. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, as though he was reaching for something just beyond his grasp. "Park, other kids, laughter," he repeated quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. Carolyn saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes, but it faded quickly, and she knew she had to keep trying. Carolyn took a deep breath and continued with another story, one of her all-time favorites. "Do you remember the first time we tried building a tree house? I was so persistent, and eventually you climbed up with me, but heights were never really your thing," she said with a grin, recalling the fear her dad tried to hide. "You were more scared than I was, but you didn't give up. You stayed with me until I felt safe, then quickly climbed down, saying you'd never do that again." She chuckled softly, waiting eagerly for a response. This time, Richard gave a faint smile, a small but noticeable reaction that Carolyn caught. "A treehouse. I think I can picture it. Wood, you, and a lot of fear," he murmured, his eyes showing a glimmer of what felt like a nearly forgotten memory. Carolyn squeezed his hand, sensing they were getting closer, that each story was bringing back tiny fragments of the past. "You always did everything for me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Even the things that made you uncomfortable. After I became a teenager, your business took off. You became a wealthy man, and work obligations pulled you in every direction. It was probably what distanced us. But I never thanked you for everything you did, Dad. Only now do I realize how much you taught me. How much of you is a part of me." She continued, feeling tears well up as she held his hand, as if that connection could somehow keep him grounded, even if his mind was elsewhere. Richard looked at her, his expression softening just a bit. "I'm sorry. Even without remembering everything, I feel like you're my daughter," he said softly, with a hint of hesitation. But there was something new in the way he looked at her. Carolyn nodded, gripping his hand a bit tighter, her heart brimming with hope. "Yes, Dad. I'm your daughter, and I'm here with you, now and always," she murmured, trying to hold back the rush of emotion. She knew this moment marked the beginning of something new. The next morning, the sun peeked through the hospital window, its gentle light touching Richard's face, warming him and bringing a sense of peace. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the gentle light filling the room with a comforting warmth. He blinked a few times, as if waking from a long, deep sleep, gradually realizing he was exactly where he was meant to be. His mind was now free of the haze of confusion and filled with a calm clarity that felt like a warm embrace. He felt every detail of that moment, the light, the sounds, like he was fully back in his own body. Beside him, holding his hand with both love and tension, was Carolyn, his daughter. Her face showed the traces of sleepless nights, the dark circles under her eyes, revealing a mix of hope and exhaustion. Richard looked at her carefully, noticing every little detail. The glistening eyes, the look of anticipation. Without hesitation, he gently squeezed her hand and whispered, his voice still hoarse but full of love. "Carolyn." His voice was soft, but just hearing her name was like a flash of light for Carolyn, who gasped, realizing he had said her name. Her eyes widened, filling with tears as she struggled to believe what she was hearing. "Dad, you remember me?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion, leaning closer as though afraid this moment might vanish. Richard smiled faintly, his eyes still half closed, but more present than ever. "Yes, my dear. I remember everything," he replied, his voice filled with a tenderness Carolyn hadn't heard in so long. She let out a sigh of relief, and the tears she had been holding back began to flow down her cheeks. Soon after, Richard noticed a small figure standing beside Carolyn. Janice, the flower girl, was watching him with a shy yet hopeful look, holding a small bouquet of flowers she always brought him. He looked at her, his expression softening as he recognized her. "Janice," he said gently, recalling the first moment he met her. "You're here, aren't you, the flower girl? You stayed here." Janice beamed, her eyes full of gratitude and admiration. "Yes, I'm here. And so are you, finally," she whispered, her smile brimming with relief. The moment was briefly interrupted when a nurse entered the room to check Richard's vital signs. Seeing that he was awake and alert, she quickly went to notify the doctors. In just a few minutes, the room filled with members of the medical team, each one visibly amazed that Richard was not only awake, but also seemed mentally sharp. One of the doctors approached him with a serious yet hopeful look. "Mr. Richard, do you know where you are? Could you tell us what you remember?" he asked, aiming to assess the level of his recovery. Richard took a deep breath, glancing at everyone in the room, feeling more whole than he had in a long time. "I know exactly where I am. I'm in the hospital. I got sick, woke up here and had to sign a few papers," he answered, his smile bringing a sense of optimism to the room. Then he looked over at Carolyn, his paternal love clear in his gaze. "She's my daughter, Carolyn, and this little one, Janice. They've been here by my side this whole time, haven't they? And her grandpa, he asked in a soft but steady voice. "He's doing fine," Janice replied, beaming as she looked at Richard, relieved to see him well. The doctor nodded, pleased with his response, but decided to run a few simple tests to confirm his memory was fully intact. He asked Richard to describe a detail about his life or personal history, just to ensure his memories had returned. "Mr. Richard, could you tell me something about your childhood or family? We just want to make sure everything is working perfectly," the doctor said, maintaining a professional tone, but with a slight smile. Richard chuckled softly, as if fragments of his life were finally rising to the surface. "I remember the house where I grew up. It was small, but we had a big garden full of flowers my mom planted," he recounted, his gaze distant but warm. "She used to say flowers were like life. You plant them, care for them, and one day they bloom. As a child, I'd spend hours watching the garden, waiting for each flower to blossom." Carolyn's eyes sparkled as she listened to her father share such a personal and meaningful memory. The doctor smiled, nodding with satisfaction at Richard's responses. "It seems everything is in working order, Mr. Richard. Your memory is indeed back, and we're thrilled with your progress." The doctor noted the results on his clipboard. Carolyn breathed a sigh of relief and held her father's hand tightly, filled with gratitude and emotion. "I knew you'd come back, Dad," she whispered, squeezing his hand firmly. Richard looked at her, feeling a rare sense of wholeness and presence. Janice, standing by her grandfather's side, watched Richard with a look of admiration and affection. She stepped closer, holding a bouquet of flowers she had brought along. "I brought these for you. I thought you might like them," she said, handing the flowers to Richard with a shy smile. Richard took the bouquet and inhaled their fragrance, feeling deeply connected to everyone around him, especially to the young girl who had supported him so much. "Thank you, Janice. She was so kind," he said. "These flowers mean a lot to me." "And so do you," he added, his voice full of warmth. Throughout the day, Richard went through further tests that confirmed his full recovery in both memory and health. The medical staff were stunned and impressed by his resilience and determination. "It's truly remarkable, Mr. Richard. Given the severity of your condition, most people in your situation wouldn't have made such a quick and complete recovery," the chief doctor remarked as he signed the papers to move Richard back to his room for observation. Carolyn stayed by her father's side the entire time, watching him with a blend of pride and relief. She knew they had come through one of the toughest trials of their lives, and seeing her father's personality and memories fully intact was the greatest gift she could have imagined. "Dad, I can't even tell you how long I've waited for this moment," she admitted, her eyes still glistening with happy tears. Richard pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly, as if to ensure she knew how much he loved her. "I know, my dear, and I'll never forget it," he murmured, comforting her. That night, after all the tests were finally completed, Richard was taken back to his room, where he could rest with his family and friends by his side. He looked at Carolyn and Janice, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I thought I might have lost you both forever, but being here with you feels like a new chance at life," he said, smiling at them both. Arthur, who had come by for a quick visit, couldn't hide the relief he felt seeing Richard fully conscious. "I knew you'd pull through. I knew I'd still get a chance to thank you for everything you've done for us," he said, deeply moved as he clasped Richard's hand. A sense of gratitude and hope filled the room, and Richard realized that each person there was a part of a new chapter in his life. When evening arrived, Richard glanced at Carolyn one last time before drifting off to sleep, feeling whole. After days of careful recovery in the hospital, he finally received the news everyone had been eagerly waiting for. He was cleared to go home. The announcement brought a surge of relief and joy to Carolyn, Arthur, and Janice, who had stayed by his side each day, witnessing every step of his progress and supporting him every moment. Richard, sitting up in bed, looked at them with a genuine smile, feeling truly blessed. "So, it's official. I can go home," he said, still amazed by his own recovery. Carolyn smiled, wiping away a tear that escaped her eyes. "Yes, Dad. We can finally bring you home," she replied, holding his hand with warmth. Janice, standing beside her grandfather, looked up at Richard with admiration. To her, he was more than just a friend. He was a hero who had risked everything to help them. "Can I see your house, Richard? I bet it's as amazing as you are brave," she asked, her eyes gleaming with curiosity and excitement. Richard chuckled, touched by the girl's sincerity. "Of course you can, Janice. I consider you and your grandpa part of my family now," he replied, glancing at Arthur with a grateful smile. Arthur, deeply moved, nodded, grateful to have crossed paths with a man with such a generous heart. "It'll be an honor, Richard. I never imagined we'd find such true friends," he said, his eyes shining with admiration. Hours later, the group left the hospital, heading to Richard's home, where he could finally fully recover, surrounded by comfort and the people who had become his true friends. When they arrived at the mansion's entrance, Janice stood in awe, taking in the grand facade, the blooming gardens, and the wide terrace, just as she had imagined. "Wow, Richard, this place is beautiful. I feel like a princess walking into a palace," Janice exclaimed, holding her grandfather's hand, her eyes wide with wonder. Richard, noticing her joy, felt a spark of rejuvenation, like he was given a fresh chance to appreciate things he once may have taken for granted. "Well, a castle needs special people to make it truly magical, and today this place feels even more beautiful with you here," he said warmly, opening the door to the mansion and inviting everyone inside. Carolyn watched quietly, her heart warmed by her father's gentle spirit. Throughout the day, Richard took Arthur and Janice on a tour of the house, letting them explore every corner with childlike excitement as they discovered this new world. In the garden, Richard pointed out the many flowers and plants, many of which he had helped grow with the assistance of skilled gardeners. "To me, these flowers represent the cycle of life," he explained softly, while Janice gently touched one of the blossoms. "They remind us that even in the hardest moments, there's always a chance for rebirth." Richard had undergone a significant change since the accident, and Carolyn found it moving to watch how her father interacted with Janice and Arthur. He seemed lighter, more attuned to the value of life's little joys. "Spending all that time in the hospital has given us a new way to look at life, hasn't it, Dad?" she asked, smiling at him. Richard nodded, his gaze soft but reflective. "Yes, my dear. I've learned that nothing holds more worth than the people we choose to keep close." Quietly, Arthur stepped closer to Richard, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of friendship and gratitude. "Thank you, Richard, for bringing us into your life. I never imagined we'd form a friendship like this, but now I feel like you're part of our family," he said, deeply moved. Richard grasped his friend's hand firmly, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "The honor is all mine, Arthur. You both have shown me the true meaning of generosity," he replied with sincerity. Later, everyone gathered in the living room, where Carolyn had prepared a small snack to celebrate her father's homecoming. Janice, full of excitement, led Richard to one of the armchairs and asked him to share a story from his childhood. "Please, Richard, I'd love to hear one of your stories. I bet you've done some brave things, just like what you did for me and my grandfather," Janice asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Richard chuckled, reminiscing about his youth, and began to share a tale from when he was just a boy exploring a forest alone in search of hidden treasures. Carolyn and Arthur listened intently, but what brought them the most joy was witnessing the bond that had blossomed between Richard and Janice, as if fate had arranged their connection. "I've never seen him this happy, Father. Maybe life was waiting for this reunion to teach us something," Carolyn murmured, and Arthur nodded in agreement. "Sometimes, life brings the right friends at the most unexpected times," he said, watching Richard and Janice laughing together. As the evening drew to a close, a sense of calmness settled over them, a welcome contrast to the intense weeks they had all endured. Sitting beside Carolyn, Richard gazed out at the garden, noticing new flowers blooming. He sighed, feeling a wave of peace. "Everything seems to be blossoming again," he muttered to himself. But Carolyn heard him and nodded, smiling gently. "Because, Father, you've learned to see the value in each moment," she responded, holding his hand warmly. As the sun began to set, Arthur glanced at Janice with a gentle smile, signaling it was time to go. Janice hesitated to say goodbye, but she approached Richard, who welcomed her with a warm embrace. "Come back any time. This is your home too," he said, as Janice waved, her eyes filled with affection. Months later, life had resumed its rhythm, but with notable changes for Richard and those around him. Since his recovery, he spent more time with Carolyn, savoring each moment together and strengthening the relationship they had let drift over the years. The once quiet mansion now echoed with laughter as Arthur and Janice visited often. All four of them were now devotedly caring for the lush gardens Richard cherished, transforming the area into a haven of shared joy and peace. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard sat on the terrace, watching the golden leaves sway, lost in thought. Janice ran up to him, holding a small pot with seedlings she had planted herself. "Richard, these flowers will grow, and every time you see them, you'll remember me," she said with a bright smile. He looked at her warmly, taking the pot and promising to care for the little plant as if it were a treasure. "I promise, Janice, they'll have the best spot in the garden," he replied, feeling grateful for the bond they had built. Arthur, meanwhile, became a confidant and a mentor for Richard. The two started taking afternoon walks in the garden together, talking about life, sharing experiences, and reflecting on the value of second chances. Richard felt that Arthur brought him a sense of peace he had never known in his previous life. "You've shown me that life is about more than just accomplishments or titles, Arthur. It's about the connections we make," Richard said gratefully. Later that evening, Carolyn called everyone to dinner, where the table was set with dishes they had prepared together. Every meal at the mansion had become a celebration of friendship and gratitude. As they talked, laughed, and shared stories, Richard looked around, his heart full of simple, genuine happiness. That night, as the group said their goodbyes, Richard watched Arthur and Janice's car disappear down the road. He turned to Carolyn with a smile. "These past few months have taught me more than all the years before them," he reflected. Carolyn smiled and nodded. "So, Dad, what else can we learn together?" Richard smiled at her question, feeling the warmth of a promising future by her side. He looked at the brightly lit mansion, now filled with life and happy memories, realizing that despite everything, life had given him a second chance, not just to live, but to truly appreciate every connection he had made. "I think we can learn to nurture happiness in every small moment, like the flowers in our garden," he replied, taking his daughter's hand as they walked back inside. Richard knew that from then on, love and friendship would be the true foundation of his renewed life. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartfelt stories almost every day. Don't miss the next captivating tale that's just about to appear on your screen. We're incredibly grateful to have you with us. Now, You can click on the links appearing on the screen. We've got a special selection just for you, filled with meaningful stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.